Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you would like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you'll find chapter links down in the video timeline. So this week, I really have just tidbits to talk about, and then I want to talk about what I'm going to call knitting genealogy, or the genealogy of sweaters. So let's get started. So the first tidbit is just that I got myself a new computer this week. My old computer was 7 years old and it was giving me trouble in terms of just editing my videos. I was having to shut everything down in order just to edit the videos or do anything else. I couldn't do anything else while the video was processing. And it was giving me trouble when I was doing live streams. So this new computer is wonderful. I love it. And so I will be able to start doing live streams again soon. I'm not sure when that's going to be. I'm still testing out things with this new computer and some of the other equipment that I got recently just to see the best combination of tools, sound quality and video quality that are going to make the live streams the best that they can be. Somebody said in the comments sometime in the past week or two, they mentioned that there was a TV program that they said was on Amazon Prime, and it is. I watched it on there, but then I found out it's also on Acorn TV, which I happen to subscribe to as well. So you can find it in at least those two places and possibly others. And it's called A Stitch in Time. There are 6 episodes to it. And the presenter is a woman. It's a British show. The presenter is a woman named Amber Butchart. And I've talked about her a couple of times before. I talked about her sometime during this whole lockdown period. She started doing a miniature series on Instagram about fashion. And I'd also talked about her previous to that because there was an article about her where, I can't remember what they call her, like a forensic fashion historian or something like that. She was helping solve murders when they would find a body that had obviously been dead for many decades, and she could help them pinpoint when they would have died based on their clothing, and in particular their underwear, because that really gives you a lot of clues. So this particular series was fascinating. So thank you, whoever it was. The comments, they get lost. I go, oh, I have to go check that out. And then I can't find the comment again later. So what this show does is it takes something like a painting or a statue or some other sort of historical artifact, and it examines the fashion, the clothing that the person that's depicted is wearing. And then they use these people who are historic recreators in terms of clothing to help recreate this item, and they research the history of the clothing at that time period and what the materials would have been made of, and what that particular piece of clothing would have signified about that person. And it's really interesting. They do a wide range of things. One of the ones in particular that might be interesting to knitters, it's not about knitting, but it's about wool. And they took a painting that's very famous and apparently has been subject to artistic critique more than almost any other painting in terms of who these people are and what is this depicting. And it's called the Analfini, I think is how it's pronounced, Analfini portrait, and it shows a man and a woman. And when I looked at the photo, I thought she was pregnant, and they were talking about this in this program. They're like, no, it's that there's so much fabric to this dress and that she's holding it up, and that's what makes her look like she's pregnant. And so they recreated this particular garment, which was made from wool broadcloth. Now, this is a term that I had heard many, many times over the years, but somehow in my mind, I always assumed it was some sort of cotton. I don't know. I was trying to imagine, what does broadcloth mean? What would that mean? But it's actually a really fine grade of wool fabric. And they showed the whole process of carding the wool, and they're spinning it in the factory, and then making the fabric, and then it goes through this kind of fulling process, which kind of makes the fabric so it doesn't fray, but it's very flexible, and it's very warm, and it's very beautiful to the touch. And so then they talked about the dyeing techniques, what the significance of the fact that her gown was green, what that meant. You know, all of these things in this painting were showing the wealth that these people had. They were merchants. They weren't aristocracy or anything. And they showed how they would have dyed something green, why it would be expensive, because you would have to dye it blue and you would have to dye it yellow. So you'd have to go through the dye process twice. And if you wanted a dark green, it would require more dyeing. And so they showed the historic techniques for dyeing these sorts of colors. And then they talked about that her gown was fur-lined, and it looked like it was just trimmed with fur, but no, you could see that the entire thing was lined with fur. And that again contributes to how heavy it is. So this woman who looks kind of like she's heavily pregnant is just really kind of balanced backwards so that she could hold this whole thing up. But at the end of the program, they've recreated this garment so that it fits Amber Bouchard, and then she tries it on, and then you can actually see what it looks like on a human and what it would feel like. And it's really, really interesting. And they cover a wide range of time periods as well as materials. Like they had one recreation that was a leather coat, a leather jacket that was depicted in a painting worn by a man who is, you know, lower class, which was really unusual. He was a hedge cutter, but there were patches on it. So they recreated the original coat that would have been made before it had been handed down multiple times and ended up with the hedge cutter. They did some armor, like the padding that would have been worn under armor, and then the cloth overlay that a king would have worn over the top of his armor to signify that he was the king and he was there out on the in the fields with the soldiers. So it's very, very interesting. So I'll leave a link down below to what the name of it's called. And like I said, it's on Amazon Prime, and it's also on Acorn TV for sure. It may be on other services. It was originally on BBC, so they may have it on one of their players in the UK. One of the episodes, and I'm trying to remember, I can't remember what episode it was, but there was a period of time when they went to this museum. It was like the Foundling Museum or something like that. And they were talking about how, I don't know if it was the 1700s or the 17th century, one of the two. But there was this place where mothers who were destitute, and they brought their infants in to be taken care of at the orphanage, and then if they could turn their lives around, they could come back and retrieve their child. And what they did, they left what was called a textile token. And so it would be a little piece of cloth. It might be from their dress or some piece of textile, and it would be put in the book along with all the information about the infant. And then when the mother was going to come reclaim the child, they would bring a textile token that would get matched up with that. And they said it was very sad because maybe 1 in 20 babies was ever retrieved, but it is the most extensive collection of fabrics from that time, particularly fabrics that would have been worn by more common people rather than the wealthy people with the elaborate fabrics. So they would have like a piece of cotton that was printed with a fabric that would be something that looks like what a wealthy person would wear who has had really heavily embroidered cloth, but this person would have had cotton that had the design printed on it. But that was really interesting. So I'm going to leave. I was really interested in that. I paused the video to go find more information. I found the Foundling Museum has an online exhibit where you can take a look at some of these pieces of fabric from this collection of textile tokens. The last thing that I want to tell you about, there is a website, tomandlorenzo.com, and they put together a gallery of covers of Stitchcraft from different decades. And so these are, Stitchcraft was a knitting magazine. So you can see a lot of them, I think, are mostly the 40s and 50s from what I remember. But all kinds of really cool, and it's just the covers, but it's really fun to see because the next vintage sweater I'm going to be knitting is going to be from the 40s. So I'm very interested in seeing the variety of styles that there are, in addition to looking through my collection of 1940s vintage knitting books. So I'm thinking about this a lot. So I thought you might enjoy that, and I'll leave the link down below. So last night I was the guest speaker for the Tigard, I think that's how you pronounce it, Tigard Knitters Guild in Oregon. And it was a Zoom meeting, just like our Knitters Guild meetings are. And I gave a presentation on vintage knittings and the stuff that I've been working on for the past, however long. And so I had to really think in the past month since they invited me to speak, like how I was going to, what the scope of my talk was going to be on, because I had, 40, 45 minutes to talk about it, what the scope is going to be and how I was going to present it. Because I've been talking about vintage and antique knitting for more than a year and a half now on this channel, but I tend to talk about it as I learn about it, or as I discover something, or as I'm knitting something, just in the order in which I'm experiencing it. And it's not necessarily a cohesive presentation to give in that way, and there's so much material. So I was really had to think about how I was going to talk about this to people who might not know who I am and who might not know anything about vintage knitting, and therefore how could I present this to them so that they could follow along and it would be interesting to them. So I did that, and it was really fun. I had a great time with it. And so this morning, I was just reviewing comments that I'd had on last week's video, and there were comments that were coming up that had been puzzling me all week. And as I read them again, having given this presentation, I suddenly was reading those comments in a different light. So let me tell you what some of the comments were. So, well, first of all, there are a lot of people who love the sweater. And when I said, I probably won't wear it, they're like, oh no, you should wear it. It's so beautiful. I'd love to wear it. So thank you. I appreciate that. Those are not the comments that were puzzling me. One of the comments was, love the sweater. Would you consider publishing the pattern as a simple V-neck and possibly modifying the sleeves and bottom of the sleeves, possibly in a simple rib or bell sleeve? In other words, leaving out all of the crochet frou-frou. And when I was saying that, I probably wouldn't wear this sweater, a lot of people were giving suggestions about what I could do to change to modify the sweater to maybe make it more wearable, particularly taking the collar off of it and then adding some other sort of neckline to it instead. And then finally, there was somebody who asked, would I consider selling it to someone who would love to wear it? So these were comments when at first, if you think about it, you're like, oh, okay, well, they're just very product focused in terms of ending up with a sweater that's very wearable. Like the focus of what they're knitting is to end up with something that you're actually going to use. And that's not always my focus. I'm often very process focused instead and learning about it. So at first, that's kind of what I thought was going on, because there's always somebody after every one of these projects who asks me, are you going to publish the pattern? And I'm like, the pattern is already published. That's how I knit it. And the modifications I made are modifications to fit me. And in order to create a published pattern, you'd have to grade it for multiple sizes. I mean, that's completely outside of the context of what I'm trying to do. And so when I say in terms of what I'm trying to do, I mean in terms of the scope of the larger project that I'm working on. And so it was this morning when the day after I had explained this project to people that I knew probably didn't know that I had this big project I was working on, that I realized a lot of you probably don't know that I knitted this Roaring Twenties sweater in the context of a much larger project. And the reason that you might not know that is because you may be a more recent subscriber. So this larger project is to knit my way through the 20th century, decade by decade, one sweater at a time. That's the project. So the Roaring Twenties sweater was one part of that project. So I was thinking, oh, well, maybe there's just new subscribers, or maybe there's people who haven't seen all of my Casual Friday videos. Maybe they've been around since then, but just didn't pick up on what this project was. But I looked back and I had, I think, around 23,000 subscribers in December of 2018 when I started this project. And last month I hit 50,000. So I have more than twice as many subscribers now as I had at the beginning. So I really did think, well, it's time for me to kind of really explain what this larger project is and what it is I'm trying to accomplish with it. And then I think you'll understand why I'm completely fine with this Roaring Twenties sweater staying as it is and me not wearing it. One of the other comments I was reading from this past week was somebody wanted to know how I happened to get into doing genealogy, and did I know anything about genealogy before I subscribed to Ancestry.com, because that's another love of mine, is doing family history research, and I often use the tools and resources and databases and subscriptions that I use for doing family history research. I often use those when I'm researching historical topics that I talk about on this podcast. And so when I was looking at that comment and I was thinking about it, I thought, I use those tools, but really what I'm doing in this project is creating a sort of family tree of sweaters and looking at the family history of sweaters and how they evolved and how they changed and what the techniques were that were being used at the turn of the 20th century versus the techniques that we switched to using throughout the 20th century. So that's part of what I'm looking for. I'm looking for what were the techniques that were being used, or what version of techniques that we use today were being used then, and then how did we end up where we are right now? Like, when did that change? How did that change? Were there specific people or specific time periods that were really influential in making changes in the way we knit and the techniques that we use? So part of my interest is in just the fascination of seeing how fashion changes. But when fashion changes, so do the pieces of the sweater and that go together, and therefore the construction method is going to change too. If I go back to how this project started, the way it started was, it was December of 2018, and every December I'm reflecting back on what I did in my knitting life that year. Were there things that I didn't want to do anymore? Were there things that I wanted to do slightly different? Were there things I haven't done that I wanted to do? 2018 was the first year of this podcast. So I was thinking about how this podcast had started. I didn't even know it was a podcast. That tells you. I just wanted to talk about my knitting life. I hadn't had a knitting group for a couple of years. I hadn't been teaching the yarn shop where I had been teaching clothes. So I was doing technique videos here at home. So I wasn't talking to knitters anymore. And I wanted to find a way to at least talk about knitting. And so one of the things I did was, well, I'm going to get myself involved in the knitting community. I'm going to go to the guild meetings. I'm going to volunteer. I'm going to take classes or do things out in the knitting community and go to events and things like that I hadn't done before, go to knitting retreats. So I wanted to get myself in the community. I wanted to learn more about different wools and breeds of wool that I hadn't knit with before. And then I thought, well, on this podcast or on this Friday video, I'll talk about things I'm learning about or events I went to or projects that I'm working on, that sort of thing. So it was a few months in when I started talking about knitting related things in my family tree, and I started blending the genealogy with the knitting related topics. So when I learned to spin that that summer, I got fascinated with the Weavers Guild, and it was founded in 1940 by these three women, and I got very fascinated by them, and I started looking them up in the census records and what happened to them, where, you know, what was written in their obituaries, you know, what their history was before they founded the Weavers Guild. And I got really interested in that, so I would share that. And so that was what I was thinking about in December of 2018. I was thinking I really enjoyed combining that history and knitting stuff, and the viewers seemed to enjoy that too. How could I do something like that? Like, what would be interesting to do? And so I thought, oh, I'll just go look in old digitized newspapers and see what kind of knitting patterns were published. I didn't know what I was going to do with that information because I didn't know what I was going to find. So at first I found like stitch patterns, and I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. They have stitch patterns, and I'll chart them out, and maybe I'll knit the swatches and just show those. Maybe that could be a series. So I charted the first one out, and there was clearly some kind of typo in there because it was supposed to be for a small lace diamond, and the pattern did not create a diamond in any way. And I thought, well, that wasn't going to work. So I kept searching, and almost right away I discovered there were actual garment patterns published in the newspapers. And in particular, the Boston Globe was a great source of knitting patterns and crochet patterns, but they had this household corner or housework corner or housework hints or something like that. And it was user submitted and user requested, or reader requested and reader submitted items. And they wanted tried and true recipes. And so they would print these patterns. There was never any image to go with them, certainly no photograph. And very rarely were there any drawings, but I was very lucky that very early on, the first knitting sweater pattern I found, or very close to the first one I found, had a drawing associated with it. And it was that drawing that pulled me in. Like, I never intended to knit any like garments. I was never interested in vintage knitting prior to this. I was just interested in seeing what was published in the newspapers and reading about it and talking about it. And so I looked at this pattern, this picture, and I was so interested in it. And as I started reading it, I realized that the things I knew about knitting and knitters from 100 or more years ago, the things that I thought I knew about it were contradicted by what I was reading in this pattern. So I thought that everything was knit at very fine gauges with very fine yarns. I thought that sweater patterns were knit in pieces, flat and seamed, the way I learned in the 80s. I thought that that's how it had always been. You know, written patterns had always been that way because that's what I'd experienced starting in the 80s. But I'd also heard other knitters say, well, written patterns are done that way because they use dressmakers techniques, and that would have been familiar to people in terms of printed written patterns. That traditionally we know that sweaters were knit seamlessly in the round, but that was in the days when people weren't using patterns. They were just learning from their mothers and grandmothers how to knit their particular style of things. So like the Scandinavian sweaters, or like a fisherman Gansey or something like that. So these are things that I thought that, you know, the traditional was in the round seamless, and then once we got written patterns, everything was flat and in pieces and then seamed up. Another thing that I had been told were that old patterns were really hard to read, that sometimes they were very tersely written and often cryptic and left a lot up to the knitter to figure out. And I had no real opinion on that because I hadn't done much reading of patterns at all. I am a master hand knitter, so I know a lot of techniques, and I often do not have trouble understanding instructions that are quite different from what you would see in a normal pattern, just because I can visualize and I can knit in my head whatever the instructions are. So I wasn't too worried about that. So I started reading this pattern, and I did notice, well, yeah, there's a lot of information missing. There's no information about the yarn, like what kind of yarn or how much of it. There was no information about gauge. There was no finished measurements. There was a bust measurement for a 36-inch bust measure. And I'm like, is that the finished measurement or the measurement of the person wearing it? I didn't know. And then, no length, nothing, no gauge, no needle sizes, even though vintage needle sizes would have been different than they are today. But they did mention in the instructions to use steel needles for the ribbing and bone needles for the body. I was like, okay, well, this, don't know what's going on here. And I start reading and I'm like, these are not terse instructions. These are extremely explicit. Like the first 17 rows were what cast on was 72 stitches. And I thought, well, that's not very many stitches at all. What am I even casting on for? Like, what part am I casting on for? And so I started reading it, and after the ribbing, changed to the body of the sweater, and then they were establishing the stitch pattern for 17 rows. Every single stitch of those 72 stitches was spelled out. Knit, the entire word, knit 5, purl 5, knit 5, all the way across. And I could tell that it was a 10-stitch repeat and that it was somehow offset from row to row, but I couldn't exactly see what was going on. But after 17 rows of that, they'd established the pattern, and they didn't keep telling you that. They just told you to continue working as the pattern was established, and then they started doing shaping. So then I could see something was changing, so I got out a piece of paper and I started drawing a schematic of what was going on here. And what I realized was that this pattern started at the bottom of the back, came up to the shoulders, the back of the neck was bound off, but then each of the fronts was continued down from the shoulder. So this wasn't knit in separate pieces. It was knit, the whole body was knit in one piece. And the shaping was fascinating because this is a pattern that was published in 1906. So it was this Edwardian era clothing. The sleeves were knit flat, but they started at the top, at the cap, and they were knit down to the cuff. That was not something I had seen before. And so already the construction method was not following what I expected. And so because of this construction method, there's no shoulder shaping. The neck was just rectangular. And it was fascinating to me what that was. And the thing that really pulled me in was I didn't understand how it all came together, because the last line of the pattern is what was really cryptic. Face the fronts of the sweater with ribbon and then sew the button and buttonholes. I'm like, how many, where, like, how do you do, where am I putting buttonholes in? I couldn't understand it. And so that is why I started knitting that first sweater. I was just trying to understand it. But before I decided to knit it, I thought, well, I'll just read more patterns and then maybe I can understand better what's going on. And so I found more patterns. I found an actual Columbia Book of Yarns book that the sweater pattern was in, had the same pattern, but it actually did have information about yarn and needle size. I was able to figure out that this was actually calling for worsted weight yarn, which is kind of what I expected, but I wasn't able to confirm without knowing. So it was worsted weight yarn. It wasn't some like lace weight or fingering weight yarn to knit this sweater. So that was not true, that everything had to be on fine needles. And it wasn't true that this was using dressmaker techniques. This was not a construction that I would expect if you were using dressmaker's techniques. It's not like it was if you were making this from woven fabric, how you would construct it. And the bit about the tersely written was not true. The patterns were presented differently than what we would expect today. It was actually, they had so much information about at the beginning for establishing the stitch pattern, it was actually more difficult to read. It was like too much information. And so I ended up charting the pattern and seeing what was going on. But there were so many surprises in that sweater. Namely, the very first surprise was how the stitch pattern behaved. It was a knit 5, purl 5 pattern that was offset. And I assumed, because the knits and purls were balanced, that the fabric would lie flat. And it didn't. It was sort of like an accordion. And that ended up being what informed me of how everything came together in the end. But I was learning so much from knitting this sweater and also reading all of the other patterns from the same era and then spreading out to, well, when did they start doing shoulder shaping? When did they start doing neck shaping? And trying to read patterns through the years. That's when I realized that there was this real evolution of not just fashion, but in how the patterns were constructed, how the sweaters were constructed, how the patterns were written, how the pattern pieces were formed, how they were put together, that it wasn't the simplistic piece of information that I had. It wasn't, oh, everything was fine gauge. Everything was based on dressmaker techniques. The old stuff was always knit in the round. You know, I had these little pieces of information that are very much like what you have when you start researching your family history. You have these little tidbits of stories in your family, and you don't really know what they mean, and you try to fill in in the blanks. You make assumptions about what that actually means. And none of the things that I thought that were true turned out to be false. It's just that they weren't true all the time in all time periods for all garments. Like that, there just wasn't, like, that isn't what was true in the past. It was true in the past at some times for some situations. And so that is what I wanted to do, is build this context, this understanding of how sweaters, how the patterns evolved, how the constructions evolved, and how the techniques that we use to form those constructions have changed. Like with short rows, they were using short rows in that very first pattern, but they were using them a little differently for a different purpose, but they're using them differently, a different technique than we would use today. And so how did we end up with, you know, the wrap and turn short row, which then led to people saying there's got to be a better way, and there's a bunch of different ways of doing short rows now, but how did we get from where we were in 1900 to that whole wrap and turn, wrap and turn, wrap and turn in every published pattern? So that was the kind of thing I was interested in. So when I decided to do this project, I kind of set up some rules or guidelines. First of all, that first sweater I knit, I didn't intend to finish it. I certainly didn't intend to wear it. In the end, I did finish it, and I don't wear it, but my daughter wanted it. So I actually ended up giving it much better finishing details than I had intended to do regularly, because I didn't want to put a lot of effort into something that it wasn't going to be used. There was no reason. I got what I wanted, which is to understand how it worked. So I decided, well, I'm going to choose sweaters that I would want to wear, because a century of sweaters is a lot of sweaters to knit and not end up wearing any of them. So I wanted to be able to wear it, and there had to be something interesting or different about the construction that would teach me something that I didn't already know, something unusual or different, or that showed the evolution of techniques and shaping and all of that. One of the other rules was that I needed to use the original instructions. I didn't want to knit a vintage or antique pattern that somebody else had already converted into modern pattern speak and had selected, you know, current yarns and given the gauge and graded it for multiple sizes. I wanted to use the original pattern, because for me, that was what was going to be fun and challenging, was figuring out what was originally meant, particularly when it came to things like the yarns, because those are all discontinued, and sometimes it can be very difficult to figure out not just what the yarn weight was, sometimes that's pretty easy, but the quality of the yarn sometimes is very important. There is very specific qualities that some yarns had that wouldn't necessarily be something you would be aware of. So I wanted to figure all of that out on my own. And these patterns come in one size, and sometimes I can knit the pattern, the size happens to be one that will fit me, and other times it's something that I'm going to have to modify, and I have to figure out how to modify it. And I want to modify it in a way that maintains the original design. I want to knit that sweater. I don't want to knit something that kind of looks like that, or that uses a certain element of that. Well, I'll do that, but I'm going to change this and do this other thing. No, I want to knit the sweater that's shown in the design and use the techniques that are in that design, unless I know there's a specific technique that I like better that will give me a better result. But I always try the original technique. If they have a particular short row technique called for in the pattern, I will try it with that technique and see if I like the result, because sometimes that surprises me. I go, oh, that works really well in this situation. I'm going to use that. And other times I'm like, no, it'd be better to use this other method instead. I do have this rule where I can modify things that aren't actually going to change the actual result. Like there were pockets that were in my World War I sweater. They were patch pockets, so you're supposed to sew the little square and then sew it on the top. And I knew that it was going to look crappy because I know what my sewing job is like. And so I converted it so that it was an inset pocket, one that I didn't have to do any sewing it on, which is a more complex technique, and hardly anyone even uses it this day and age, never mind using it back then. But it achieved the same result. The pockets were in exactly the same place. They're the same size. They function exactly the same. And no one's going to look at that and go, oh, that's not authentic. So the modifications I can make are to make the fit better without changing the actual design itself. So what I thought I would do is take you guys down memory lane a little bit with these sweaters, because I think probably some of you haven't seen these, or maybe haven't seen them in a long time, and it might be interesting to see them kind of in decade order as I have them so far. So this is the very first sweater that I knit. This is the one that I found in the newspaper from 1906. It's actually from the Columbia Book of Yarns that was published in 1904. And it was also reprinted in the Columbia Book of Yarns in 1907. So this sweater started at the back, and it was worked up to the shoulders, and then you came over the shoulders. And when you came over the shoulders, when you got past the part of the shoulder where you needed to cast on for the neck, the number of stitches you had to cast on was the same number, would result in the same number you had for the entire back. So each of the fronts is just as wide as the entire back. And that was one of the things that puzzled me. I was like, because I didn't know the fabric was going to do this accordion thing. I was like, is there an overlap? What's going to go on with that fabric? So as you knit down, well, first of all, the seam of the back goes up the edge of the back. It's not centered under the arm in the center side seam like we have today. It came up the back edge came up the edge of the back. And when you come down to the underarm here, then you would cast on all of the stitches for the entire width. And then you'd knit straight for a bit, and then you started working short rows to create what they call the pouch. So back in this era, they would have had this pigeon-breasted look. So there would have been padding that would have been holding all of this out. But this would still droop down in front a little bit. And so you would knit all the way across to here, most of the way back, come back, and then shorter and shorter each time. So you're creating more length here in the front. And then before you did the ribbing, you would go across all of these stitches, and you would decrease in groups of 3 and 4. So knit 3 together, knit 4 together, knit 3 together. So you're getting rid of all of these extra stitches in order to work the ribbing. And then you come back up to the left side, and you do everything you did on the right side, only reverse. So that's the terseness of the instructions, is they don't tell you how to knit the left front. They assume that you can figure that out after them telling you how to knit the right front. And then the sleeves were, a certain number of stitches were cast on, and then you keep increasing as you go back in order to form a pretty wide cap, because again, you've got this accordion fabric. So the thing that always puzzled me about this was, how is this going to close in the front? And once I knit the two fronts, I realized that there weren't two flat pieces of fabric like a regular cardigan where you overlapped one with the other. What was happening was, the back side of this fabric, of each piece of fabric, were facing each other. And so when you lined them with ribbon, you could put the buttons and the buttonholes in these ribbons, and you could button it through this buttonhole and have the button stay between the ribbon and the actual knitted fabric. So then that also allowed this to just come together edge to edge up here, and I learned how to do buttonhole loops using buttonhole stitch, and used purl buttons for those two things. So that is what I did with this first sweater. And I love the way it looks. I would never wear it. And I think, if you really wanted to wear this in a modern sense, then you probably wouldn't need as much droop in the front. There are things that you could do to maybe make it sort of trendy with puffy sleeves and stuff without quite going to this extent. So this sweater is my World War I sweater. It was called the Serviceable Sweater. And it has pockets in the front, and it has the shawl collar. So this one was knit all in pieces from the bottom up. The sleeves were knit from the top down though. And the nice thing about knitting things from the top down, even if you're knitting them flat and have to seam them in later, is that you can adjust the length. That's where you could always sew this in and then just confirm the length before you finish the cuffs. So this had shoulder shaping. So this was knit in pieces, and there was shoulder shaping on the back only, and they used short rows, and they called for just a simple turn and going back in the other direction. I decided I didn't want that. I wanted something that wouldn't leave the little hole. And then the sleeve cap was, you cast on all the stitches for the sleeve cap, and you worked short rows to shape the cap, the sleeve cap. And this time they wanted you to just turn and slip a stitch. So I didn't know how that would look with this pattern, and I tried it, and once again I decided to use a different short row technique. I used German short rows for both of them, and I liked the result just fine. One of the reasons I wanted to knit this is because I really love the shawl collars of the early 20th century, and this sweater had one. Unfortunately, there was a printer's error in the pattern, and the only instruction for the shawl collar was the very last line, which is to repeat the last 3 rows until 2 stitches remain. So whatever was going on until you had 2 stitches at the point. So my assumption was that originally it started with 2 stitches, got wider and wider up to some point, and then maintained the width all the way around, and then began to do the decreases. But I didn't know how wide it needed to be. And so I decided to knit it in 2 pieces, and each of them starting from the front, and I would do the width up. I kept making it wider until it got up to the shoulder, and then I kept it straight, and I actually ended up putting in some short rows too, just as it turned the corners, and then I had it join in the back. So this is a situation where I know that I used techniques that wouldn't have been in the original pattern, but I don't know what the original pattern said to do. And so I thought, well, if I guessed wrong about the width, then I could just rip back to the place where it needed to be different, and I wouldn't have to re-knit the entire thing. So I ended up knitting this. You can see from the photo that this is quite a bit wider, this shawl collar, than what was originally called for. But I tried it on, and I really liked it. I loved that it came up the back of my neck. So I kept it, and I wore this sweater a lot. The other modifications I made was I did do some increases at the very beginning. I cast on extra stitches and then decreased them out because I thought it was going to come down lower on my hips, and I was worried about it being too tight. I could have gotten away with not doing that because it didn't come down quite as low as I thought it would. So this is the 1920s sweater. This is a sweater from 1922. From the Corticelli 18 book. This sweater, so the 20s was a period where they really were starting to use dressmaker techniques because of the influence of Coco Chanel. During World War I, when she started to design, she couldn't get regular wool fabric because it was needed for a soldier's uniform. So she ordered jersey fabric, which is a fine gauge wool fabric meant for underwear. She ordered that, and she used that to make her designs. So she was starting to use this machine knit jersey fabric in order to make casual clothing that was very fashionable, because prior to that, sweaters were athletic garments. So in the Serviceable Sweater, my World War I sweater, the model was posed with a riding crop. The Columbia sweater from 1904 posed with a golf club. So these were garments that you wore while you were sweating. That's why they were called sweaters. So 1922 really changed that. You still would have a tennis sweater or golf sweater, something like that, but you would also have something that was just fashionable. And so during that decade, you saw pattern pieces really taking on dressmakers' techniques, some of them really forming those pattern pieces to the same shapes that you would see with woven fabrics. And so that really does require flat pieces, because it's just easier to shape that way than to try to do that seamlessly. It's not that you can't do that. It's much more difficult to try to alter something that way and to get the fit exactly right. So that's when we start entering into the completely done in pieces, and usually bottom up and then seamed. But this sweater was a little different. This one was knit in all one piece, starting at the bottom of the back up to the armholes, and then you cast on all of the stitches for the 2 arms, and you knit this completely without shaping. There were bind off and cast on as you were knitting the edges that were going to create these slashes, and you get up to the shoulders, and you have to reverse everything. You just have to reverse how you knit these shapes all the way down. So the modifications I made for this was to add an extra stripe, motif stripe and plain stripe. You can see I've got 2 blue ones because I needed more length. And another modification I made was to, I don't know if you can even see here, but I have this triangular shaped gusset in the underarm and another gusset right here in the sleeve in order to create more circumference in the upper arm, because I knew that was going to be too tight for me. And so I could make it so that it fit me, but it didn't change the design. So this is the 1930s sweater. This is one that was called a popular model. And this one was from a British pattern company. In this era, the sweaters got much more form-fitting, and they sat at the natural waistline, so it's actually quite a bit higher. I made this a little bit longer for me because I'm a taller and I have a long torso, but it wasn't quite long enough because I don't have anything with a waistband that's up that high. So I'm going to have to get some other fabric. This is knit in pieces, bottom up, including the sleeve. Each of the pieces was knit separately, and then this bodice was what was really interesting, and this is the reason I knit this sweater, because this is not decreased here. What is going on is I worked across to here, turned and slipped that stitch, so I was doing a short row, came back, stopped a stitch early, turned and slipped all the way back. So all of these stitches were on the needle like this, but there were too few of them for a length of fabric that long. And so as I knit back across, in between each of those slipped stitches, as I was working them, I lifted the running thread between the stitches and then worked that as a make one increase. That was a very common type of short row, not where you do the make one, but lifting that running thread was very common to do that and then work it together with the slip stitch. That effectively is like a Japanese short row or German short row. So that was a really interesting technique that was used back then, and it was used for decades. So that's one of the mysteries I'm trying to solve, is when did that method of short row kind of go out of favor? When did that change? One of the things I had to do because this neck is just, the yoke is just worked and the neck of your body is forward, and so it drops the front of the neck. That brings the back up. So I needed to add some length in the back in a way that wouldn't be disrupted by this horizontal pattern. So I did some short rows here on the bottom of this yoke to create more width along here, and then knit the rest of the yoke as it was instructed. So far, I've got 4 decades of the 20th century knit. I learned to knit in the 80s, so I've knit plenty of sweaters from the 80s or 90s. Not sure what I'm going to do when I get to that point. So I think of myself as really having 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s left to do, and so I will be doing the 1940s next, not sure exactly what. But I thought it might be useful to just sort of reiterate what this larger project is, because I don't think I really mentioned it in a long time, and I think a lot of you probably weren't aware that each of these sweaters is a small part of a larger project that I'm working on. And you'll perhaps understand why I'm not going to change the collar of the 1920s sweater. It doesn't matter to me if someone ends up wearing it or not. It's still useful to me in the context of this collection of 20th century sweaters. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.